I hope that you are well, and I also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today we'll be doing our grade 8 English lesson on direct and indirect objects. And before we start with our lesson, we're going to log on to aplusstudents.ca. Once we've logged on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password, and then we're going to select the subject of language arts, grade 8, and then we're going to scroll down up until we get to the chapter of direct objects and indirect objects. So direct and indirect objects. All right. So our chapter is direct and indirect objects. Our subject is English language arts, grade 8. And the lessons that we're going to be focusing on under the chapter of direct and indirect object is it a direct object or is it an indirect object? So we're going to find out what is a direct object and what is an indirect object. All right. So a direct object, right? It is the pronoun, the noun, or it is a noun phrase that receives the action of a verb. So a direct object, like we say, it is either a pronoun, it is a noun or noun phrase that receives the action of a verb. So it receives the action of a verb. And to find the direct object within a sentence, right, we need to locate the action verb and ask questions like what or whom it is acting on. So basically, once again, to find the direct object within a sentence, right, then we need to first locate the action verb, like find the action verb, locate the action verb, and we need to ask ourselves questions like what is it acting on or whom it is acting on. So, for example, it says Jane admires her neighbor. So, Jane admires her neighbor, right? So, now if we ask ourselves the question, whom does Jane admire? Because admire is our verb. So, whom does Jane admire? Then we can say Jane admires her neighbor. So, her neighbor is then our direct object within a sentence. So, whom does Jane admire? It's her neighbor. So, which means that her neighbor is the direct object within the sentence. Charlie baked a cake. So, Charlie baked a cake. So, now we need to ask ourselves, what did Charlie bake? And we can say that Charlie baked a cake. So, a cake is what Charlie baked. And a cake is a direct object within a sentence because it basically shows us or tells us what or whom it is acting on. It receives the action of the verb, right? All right. And then some of the verbs, right, or some verbs that have a direct object, they can also have an indirect object. So some verbs have a direct as well as an indirect object. And an indirect object, right, it is the pronoun or it is the noun or the noun phrase that receives the direct object of the verb. So if we go back to over here where Jane admires her neighbor, and then we see the direct object is her neighbor, right? It shows whom Jane admires. So now they're saying that the indirect object, right? It receives the direct object of the verb. Receives the direct object of the verb. So an indirect object, right? The indirect object, it always appears basically in between a verb as well as its direct object. So an indirect object, it always appears in between a verb as well as the direct object. And we see that in order for us to also locate the indirect object, so firstly, if we want to if we want to locate the if we want to find the direct object, then we need to locate the action verb, right? And ask what or whom it's acting on. But now, if we want to find the indirect object within a sentence, then we need to locate the action verb and its direct object. And we need to ask ourselves to what or to whom the direct object is being given, or for what or for whom the action is being performed. Right? So an indirect object, right? It is either a pronoun, it is a noun, or it is a noun phrase, right? That receives the direct object of the verb. And remember, we said that the direct object, it either tells us what or whom something is acting on. So we see that the indirect object, it always appears in between the verb and as well as the indirect object, the direct object, sorry. So it appears in between the verb as well as the direct object. And in order to find the indirect object within a sentence, we then need to locate the action verb and we need to find its direct object, and we need to ask ourselves questions like to what the direct object is being given, or to whom the direct object is being given. Or we can ask ourselves for what the action is being performed, or for whom the action is being performed. So if we look at an example, right? It says Charlie baked his mom a cake. So Charlie baked his mom a cake. So we need to ask ourselves, for whom did Charlie bake a cake? So for whom did Charlie bake a cake? And then we can say it is for his mom. So his mom is our indirect object within the sentence. And remember, you should be careful not to confuse an indirect within an indirect object with an object of preposition. So we should not confuse an indirect object with an object of a preposition. And an object of a preposition is a pronoun or a noun phrase that comes directly after a preposition. The pronoun or a noun phrase that directly come after words such as to, for, in, under, or during. All right. And an example, right? It says Charlie baked a cake for his mom, right? So Charlie baked a cake for his mom. So that word for, right, is a preposition. So which means that his mom is an object of a preposition. Because that basically comes after a preposition. All right. So we see that here his mom is an object of a preposition, right? Because the must comes after the word for, which is a preposition, and it's not an indirect object, right? So you can basically tell because his mom comes directly after the preposition for, as I stated, and because it does not appear in between the verb baked and the direct object a cake. And remember we said that a an indirect object, right? It appears between a verb as well as the direct object. And in this case, it is not doing that. So when it comes to direct and indirect object, then we also need to know the difference between a direct and an indirect object, right? And like we also said, that we need to be careful not to confuse an indirect object with an object of a preposition. And an object of a preposition is when the, let's say the object, it comes after the preposition, right? So it's when the pronoun or the noun phrase comes directly after the preposition. So that then becomes a object of a preposition. It is not an indirect object and it's not a direct object, but it's an object of preposition because it comes directly after preposition. And we said a direct object, right? It appears between a verb as well as a direct object. Right? And we are doing a tutorial lesson on aplusstudents.ca. So now we're going to our lesson on aplusstudents.ca, where our chapter is direct and indirect object, and the lesson is it a direct object or is it an indirect object? All right. So we said that a direct object is either a pronoun, it's a noun, or it's a noun phrase that receives the action of a verb. And in order for us to find the direct object within a sentence, we have to locate the action verb and ask ourselves to what or whom is it acting on? So we see that a direct object is a pronoun, noun, or noun phrase that receives the action, and we ask ourselves questions like, what or whom is it acting on? And then we have an indirect object, right? Which is also a pronoun, a noun, or noun phrase, but in this case, that receives the direct object of a verb. And the indirect object, it always appears in between the verb as well as the direct object. All right. So we have a direct object, we have an indirect object that comes between a verb as well as a direct object, and then we have a preposition object of preposition, right? And that is when our noun, pronoun, or noun phrase comes directly after a preposition. So now it does not become an indirect object anymore. It now becomes a preposition or an object of preposition, right? So now if we look at this word, it says, is the word in bold a direct object or is it an indirect object? That movie gave me nightmares for weeks. So the word me, right? So that movie gave me nightmares for weeks. So we need to say, is that a direct object or an indirect object? All right. So me, because it's not asking whom or what it is acting on. All right. So we said that the direct object is a pronoun, noun, or noun phrase that receives the action of the verb. And we need to locate the action verb and ask ourselves to what and whom it is acting on. All right, so now let's go to our test. So we're going to our test where we need to say if the phrase in bold is either a direct object or if it's an indirect object. So we need to say is the phrase in bold, which is end of a season party, if that is either a direct or indirect party. Object, sorry. It says Coach King threw her swim team an end of season party. So we need to say if it's a direct object or it's an indirect object. So what do you think? What is the option? Is this a direct object, basically saying what or whom it is acting upon? So we need, oopsie. So we need to say what it is acting on or whom it is acting on. and it is a direct object. So, is the phrase in bold a direct object or is it an indirect object? It says Camille built her clients a sleek new website. Camille built her clients a sleek new website. All right, so it says Camille built her clients a sleek new website. So we need to say if it's either a direct object or if it's an indirect object. So we either need to ask ourselves what or whom did Camille buy her clients? What did she buy her clients? All right, so we said Camille built her clients a sleek new website. So now we need to ask ourselves, what did Camille build her clients? So what did Camille build her clients? And she built her clients a sleek new website. Mm-mm. So we said it is a sleek new website. And we specifically said this. Remember, we said when it's a direct object, you need to ask yourself either what it is doing and whom, right? And if you can answer that question, then it is a direct object. An indirect object is when the word, or let's say the noun, is in between the verb as well as a direct object. For example, Wendy owes Maki $20 for last night's dinner. We need to say if this is a direct object or if it's an indirect object. So we need to say is the word in bold a direct object or if it's an indirect object. Wendy owes Maki $20 for last night's dinner. If you ask this question, does it tell you whom or what it is acting on? And remember, we said with an indirect object, it is in between a verb as well as the direct object. All right, so when we say Wendy owes Maki $20 for last night's dinner, then we will say it's an indirect object because we said that the noun comes in between the verb, which is owes, as well as the direct object. So it was an indirect object. All right. So Harry caught us a huge fish for lunch. So what did Harry catch us for lunch? Harry caught us a huge fish or huge catfish for lunch. A huge catfish for lunch. All right. And if we ask ourselves, what did Harry catch? Then we would say Harry caught a huge catfish. So that is a direct object. Remember, indirect object comes between a verb as well as a direct object. All right, so now we say the pie shop owner happily baked Farah a fresh blackberry pie for her birthday. So the pie shop owner happily baked Farah a fresh blackberry pie for her birthday. So we need to say that's a direct object or an indirect object. So we can say, basically, we can ask, what did the pie owner bake Farah? And she baked a fresh blackberry pie for her party. So Connor prepared his family a delicious herb roasted chicken for dinner. So Connor prepared his family a delicious herb roasted chicken for dinner. Is that a direct object or an indirect object? Delicious herb roasted chicken. So we need to ask ourselves, what did Connor prepare his family? And Connor prepared his family a delicious herb roasted chicken for dinner. And yes, Gigi, a direct object is correct. So well done. And at our favorite Indian restaurant, my father always orders us an extra canola for dessert. So at our restaurant or at our favorite Italian restaurant, my father always orders us an extra cannoli for dessert. All right. So we said at our favorite Italian restaurant, my father always orders us an extra cannoli for dessert. So we need to say that it's a direct object or an indirect object. All right. So our favorite Italian restaurant. So father always orders extra cannoli for us. So extra cannoli is our direct object. So well done. Direct object is correct. So the movie or that movie gave me nightmares for weeks. So that movie gave me nightmares for weeks. Is that a direct object or is that an indirect object? So the word me, is that a direct object or an indirect object? And remember, we said that when it comes to a direct object, you need to ask yourself what or whom it is acting on. An indirect object is again in between a verb as well as a direct object. So that movie gave me nightmares for weeks. So we need to say that movie gave me nightmares for weeks. Is that a direct or an indirect object? So gave me. So we can say this is an indirect object. And remember, we said an indirect object, it comes after or between a verb as well as a direct object. So it's an indirect object. And then Nina left the hotel staff a gracious thank you note. So is that a direct object or is it an indirect object? So what did Nina leave? What did Nina leave the hotel staff? We need to say that a direct or indirect object. If we ask the question, what did whoever asks, then it is a direct object. So it answers that question. So if it answers the question, who or what it is acting on, then it's a direct object. If it comes after a verb, then it is an indirect object. All right. Ooh, it's actually an indirect object, right? So well done, Gigi. It is an indirect object, not a direct object. So well done. Indirect is correct. All right, let's do the last one. It says in 1983, Columbia University awarded Alice Walker the Pulitzer Prize for her novel, The Color Purple. So we need to say is that a direct object or an indirect object? So we need to say if it's a direct or an indirect object. Direct object, let's see. And it is a direct object. So well done. Well done. All right. So we said that we did direct and indirect object, right? And we see the direct object is either a pronoun, noun, or noun phrase that receives the action. And we ask ourselves questions like what or whom is it acting on? And then we have an indirect object, right? Which is also a pronoun, noun, or noun phrase that receives the direct object of a verb. And we see that a direct object, it appears between a verb as well as a direct object. And in order for us to locate the action verb and the direct object, we need to ask ourselves to what or to whom the direct object is being given, or for what or for whom the action is being performed. All right. So that is now the end of our lesson on direct objects as well as indirect objects. Thank you very much for joining the class. Thank you very much for interacting, giving answers, right? And I really hope you're going to have an amazing evening further. Goodbye.